This morning's scripture reading will be from 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 8. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends.
Good morning. So if you were to tell somebody that we're going to have a series of lessons on love, I suppose that 1 Corinthians 13 would be one of those automatic places in the Bible where people would assume that you're going to be preaching on. And we've been studying love since January, and it's now middle of August, and I finally got to 1 Corinthians 13. So if you were anticipating a lesson on that topic, then, or on that chapter, then we're finally there. And it's been a long time coming, I feel like. We've referenced it a few times, but really haven't gone too in depth into this section. And so for this quarter, as we're talking about loving one another, this is where it really fits well. So we've kind of done our foundational work that we did in the first couple of weeks of this quarter, where we talked about Jesus' command that we love one another, and that is the hallmark of Christian discipleship. We talked about love being the indicator that we are alive in Christ, and according to our theme verse for the year, that love is that indicator that God abides in us. And those are kind of the foundational statements for this series of lessons on loving one another. And then we've begun delving deeper into the idea of who is my neighbor and who do we love, and what does that love need to look like, and those kind of things. So we finally have gotten to this point of 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and looking at the qualities of love. And we're going to spend at least this week and next week, possibly even a third week, kind of depending on how it shakes out with the next lesson in the series. But we'll spend at least the next 2 weeks talking about the qualities of love. And then we'll get into the application part of what it really is going to look like for us to do the work of loving people, because we've laid a lot of groundwork. We're really kind of getting into the weeds, or into the details about what love is and what it looks like, and then that's all good, but it's really not worth a whole lot if we don't actually go out and do it, if we don't actually go out and love people. And so all of this is leading us to the point of being able to say, okay, now here's how we do it. Here's what it's going to look like in our daily lives if we do love people. And so kind of the direction my mind has gone with this passage, and the way that I'm going to handle these things over the next couple of weeks, just so we have kind of a roadmap of what we're doing. Love is that overarching principle for all of Christian living. When Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? What is that greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then there's a second greatest commandment. What is that? Love your neighbor as yourself. And on these two things hang the whole law and prophets, is what Jesus said. And we're not accountable to the law and the prophets. That's the Old Testament. But Jesus has carried those two great commands into the new covenant. And we are accountable to those two things, and those two things summarize everything that we need to be about as God's people. We love God and we love people, and everything that God asks us to do falls into those two categories, or falls into that way of thinking. And so we better have an understanding. We'd better have a handle on what it means to love, and how I do that, how I demonstrate love to God, how I demonstrate love for my fellow man. Because if we are just going to go out and kind of live our lives in a haphazard way, if we're just going to kind of go out and bounce around like balls in a pinball machine, and we interact with people on a regular basis, and sometimes we do the right thing and sometimes we don't do the right thing, that's not what God calls us to do. God calls us to be targeted. He calls us to be focused on doing His will And his will is summarized in the idea of loving him and loving others. And so we really need to have a handle on what it means to love. And sometimes that's obvious. Sometimes I know in this situation, here's what I need to do to demonstrate love. Other times it's not as obvious. Other times I walk away from a situation where I've interacted with somebody and I'm kind of scratching my head. I think I demonstrated love in that situation. I feel like I tried to, but was my interaction with that person really what love demanded, really what love dictated that I should do? And so we need to become as clear as we can on what love looks like, on what love is. And so we want to break love down into its component parts, into its individual markers, so that we can understand what the loving thing to do is in any given situation. And by understanding love's component parts, we then can evaluate our own efforts. We can evaluate our desires and our efforts to love others and determine whether or not we are being the people that God calls us to be. And that's what I want us to do with 1 Corinthians chapter 13, because Paul really demonstrates for us, or gives us kind of a list of the component parts of love. And so for today, we're going to talk about what love is and what love is not, just based on exactly what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13. In a future lesson, we'll talk about what love does and what love does not, because those four things are the categories that Paul gives us. He says in verse 4 there, 1 Corinthians 13:4, love is patient, love is kind. It is not jealous. It is not arrogant. And so those are just a couple of the things that we'll look at. And then, in verse 4 there, he says, love does not brag. So there's a does not. And we're just going to identify those things. Now, if you're reading from a translation other than New American Standard, I don't know why you would be, but if you are, that was a joke. If you are reading from a translation other than New American Standard, you may have a little different verbiage, a little different wording. We're going to go with mine because I get to stand up here and y'all have to sit there. So we're going to kind of break these verses down and look at them according to the language that we have in the New Testament and see what love is and what love is not. And that's where we're at today. So we'll jump right into it. Love, first of all, is patient. And I think maybe it's possible that nearly 2,000 years ago when Paul wrote these words, he chose this one first because he was thinking about me. He knew that above all things, that guy standing there in McPherson, Kansas, all those years from now is going to need to understand that patience is a quality of love. And if he's going to preach about love for a year, and he's going to really dedicate himself to understanding love, that he needs to first of all understand that patience is associated with love. And I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but maybe, just maybe, it's true for some other people as well. And so what does this word patient, we're not going to do like, I'm not going to give you a Greek quiz. I'm not a Greek scholar, but I can look words up and see what they mean and stuff. And so when we get into some of these definitions and things, it goes back to the meaning of the word as it originally appears in the text. And so this word, as a meaning, just some things to think about. It means long-tempered. Well, I mean, we know people who have short fuses, right? And that's, exactly what that means. If you know that somebody has a short fuse, they're impatient. They're not going to, you're not going to get to poke them very many times before they blow up. But patience, somebody who is patient, they have a long fuse. They're long-tempered. I really like the idea of it being anger deferred. This is a situation where maybe anger could be an appropriate response, where anger might be building up, but I'm going to put that off. I'm going to choose not to be angry in this situation. I'm going to defer that anger, and let's see if we can handle it without being angry first. It's refusing to retaliate with anger. It's long-suffering because it only expresses anger as the Lord directs. God tells us, be angry, but what? But do not sin, right? Anger is an emotion that God has given us. Anger is an appropriate response at times to things that may happen in our lives. But when we respond in anger, or when we allow anger to control us, then problems arise. And so even if you're in a situation where anger is an emotion that you're feeling, where anger is an emotion that is welling up, it may not be the loving thing to do to express that anger, or at least to allow that anger to overtake you. And so patience is that counterbalance to anger. It's that thing that keeps anger in check. And I really like that picture of not expressing anger other than as the Lord allows us, or the Lord directs us to express anger. And so a couple of passages that we can think about that sort of drive home this point. Here's a passage that we looked at just recently as we talked about forgiveness in Matthew chapter 18. We have the parable of the servant who owed his king a large amount of money, and he didn't have the ability to pay it back. And when the king came to him and asked him for that debt to be paid, the man responded in Matthew chapter 18, verse 26, the servant responds, therefore falling down, prostrated himself before him, before the king that is, saying, have patience with me, and I will repay you everything. Defer your anger. I know you expected payment for that debt today. I don't have the money. You have the right to be angry with me. What I'm asking you to do is defer that anger to a later date. I'm asking for more time, and don't express that anger toward me now, even though you have a right to. Don't express that anger in this moment. Be patient with me. That's what he asks the king. And the king, as we know from the story, shows patience. He demonstrates love and forgiveness toward the servant, and he forgives that debt. And then what does the servant do? He goes right out and he finds a fellow servant who owes him a small amount of money, and he demands payment for that small amount of money. And in verse 29, his fellow slave falls down and he says the exact same words. He falls down and begins to entreat him, saying, have patience with me and I will repay you. You have a right to be angry today because you're owed this money and I was supposed to pay it, but I don't have it. I'm asking you to defer your anger to a future date. And that servant then turned around and he expressed his anger towards that servant. He did not have patience with him. And so because of that, then the king gets involved back in the story, and the first servant is punished because of his unforgiving attitude. And so patience, putting off that anger that we could express in a moment, even if it's justified, even if it's a righteous anger, putting that off and demonstrating is demonstrating patience. I've got to get the clicker, otherwise I can't push the button. Excuse me. Thank you for your patience. So patience then becomes that anger deferred, and when we love other people, love is patient. Love is my decision, my commitment to being patient with people, even at a time when I might have the right to be angry with them. But I'm going to defer that anger. I'm going to put off that anger and choose to show them love instead. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 14, Paul writing there to the church in Thessalonica, he says, we urge you, brethren, admonish the unruly, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with everyone. Now notice the different things that are mentioned before that. He tells them to admonish those who are unruly, those who are causing problems within the fellowship, those who are not doing the things they're supposed to be doing. Correct them, admonish them, call them on it, don't give them a free pass, but at the same time, be patient with them. Give them grace, give them the ability and the room to be able to grow and change. And sometimes, we get stuck in this idea of, I corrected you once and you didn't change, and so now I'm going to write you off, and you don't get any more chances with me because I already told you once to quit doing it, right? But Paul says, in the context of admonishing those who need to be admonished, in context of correcting those who need to be corrected, we still demonstrate patience because that's what love demands. Love demands that we be patient with people. And so that's the first thing that love is, that Paul tells us about there in 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient. And we need to work on that, or at least I need to work on that. And I assume that other people do as well. Paul also goes on to say that love is kind. And I thought this, it was interesting to me that this was the only usage of this particular word in the New Testament, or this form of the word at least in the New Testament is the way that Paul uses it here. And it has a root word that will include kind of in the definition. But this word means full of service to others. It means useful, to show oneself to be mild, to act benevolently, to be gentle. That's the word that Paul chooses to use there when he says that love is patient, but love is also kind. It is mild. It gives a mild response. It doesn't give an over-the-top response to things. It gives a useful response. I'm reminded of like TV shows or movies or whatever that you've seen when somebody needs a specific tool, but that tool's not in reach, and so they hand them something completely useless, like I need a hammer, but I don't have one, so here's my shoe. Well, that's not going to get you very far if you really need a hammer, right? And so it's not useful. Well, I gave you something. I gave you what I had. Well, yeah, but it still wasn't useful. It doesn't help me in this situation. And being kind, love demands that we be kind. And being kind means that we give people what is useful in that situation. And so the root word there, the basic form of that word that Paul chooses to use in 1 Corinthians 13 has with it the idea of furnishing what is suitable, what is pleasant, what is good. And that connection between kindness and goodness is really what one author hinted at as he was writing about this word. In the English language, you might be able to make the case that you can do something that is kind, but it's not necessarily good. Like the English, the way that the English word is defined, kindness and goodness don't necessarily go together. But in the original language that Paul was writing in Greek, they have to be together. Kindness and goodness have to be melded together in one thought. And so you can't do something kind for somebody if it wasn't the good thing to do. And you can't do something good for somebody if it wasn't also kind. And I thought that was an interesting point to make. And then he went on to write about from God's perspective. Think about what that means, because God has a different perspective than we do. We have typically, kind of an immediate physical perspective when we're thinking about what we might do to help someone, but God has an eternal perspective. And so from God's point of view, he's always going to do what is good spiritually. He's always going to do what is good eternally. And that defines what kindness is. We're going to do what is kind based on an eternal outcome, not always based on a physical or an earthly outcome. And that's something that we need to embrace as our perspective as well. That when I do something for somebody, I want it to be kind, not just from a physical standpoint, but from an eternal standpoint. And that's what love demands of me, because that's what God demonstrates in his love for us, that he is always going to do what is good and what is kind from an eternal perspective. So a couple of things to think about, or a verse or two to consider here. Ephesians 4, verse 32. This is one, when we adopted two little boys that sometimes, did mean things to one another and pushed each other and got in fights and stuff. This was a verse that got quoted at our house often and was a memory verse. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ also has forgiven you. That's our benchmark. Paul says love is kind, and our directive is to be kind to one another. Well, he hit me first. Well, that wasn't kind of him. But what are you going to do in response? Because kindness in this situation demands that you respond in kindness, even when you've been injured, even when you've been hurt. So we're going to be kind to one another, even when we feel like we should respond in some way that represents anger. So our kindness here is measured in comparison to the kindness that we have received from God. Be kind to one another, just as God in Christ also has forgiven you. That's the benchmark that Paul gives us here. Sometimes I don't feel like being kind. Sometimes I'm irritated. Sometimes somebody's pushed my buttons. Sometimes my patience has run out. Sometimes I'm a little bit of a short fuse. And Paul says, be kind. And I don't want to be kind. And Paul reminds me, God was kind to you. You pushed his buttons. You gave him a reason to react in anger through your sin, but God has chosen to respond to you in kindness. And so you need to be kind as well. Our kindness is measured in comparison to the kindness that God has shown us. And we can see that again in another passage in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. Peter, there writing, says, like newborn babies, long for the pure milk of the word, so that by it you may grow in respect to salvation, if you have tasted the kindness of the Lord. Has anyone here, can you, if I were to ask you to raise your hand, could you with integrity raise your hand and claim that God has never been kind to you? God has shown us kindness. God has shown us kindness in the form of his Son, Jesus Christ. He has shown us kindness in material blessings. He has shown us kindness through all manner of spiritual blessings. God has been kind. And that is the context in which then God turns around and tells us that we need to be kind to others. It would be one thing if we served the image of God that some people have, especially when they want to talk about a difference between an Old Testament God and the New Testament God, which is irritating when they do that, because it means they don't know the Old Testament at all. But God is love. He was love in the Old Testament. He's love in the New Testament. And God has demonstrated kindness to us. And it's one thing if we served a God the way that some people view God, where they think he sits up there with a lightning bolt, all he's ready to do is strike whenever you mess up, and that's all God is he's just waiting for you to mess up so he can strike. But then he turns around and tells me I have to be nice to people. That's just not very, very good of God to do. Well, if that's who God truly was, they'd be right. But that's not who God is. God is kind, and he has demonstrated kindness to us by the way that he has treated us. And then he turns around and he tells us, now I expect you to be kind to others as well. So love is patient, love is kind, and God demonstrates both of those qualities. He demonstrates both of those to us in the way that he treats us. So that's what love is. And really, those two things, if you look through that list in 1 Corinthians 13, when it comes to what is love, those are the only two things, at least in the New American Standard, the way that it's worded. Love is patient, love is kind. And then there are a couple of there are is nots, and then we'll talk more over the next lesson or two about the does and the does nots. So love is patient, love is kind. And if we want to be people who love, we need to be people who are kind. We need to be people who are patient. And if we're not being patient and we're not being kind, then can we claim to be loving? Well, probably not. And so that's what love is. Now let's look for a few minutes at what love is not. Love is not jealous. Love is not jealous. And this word jealous means bubbling over, means to burn with zeal, to be deeply committed to something, which doesn't sound too bad. It means to be earnest, completely intent upon, or to set one's heart on something. And honestly, you know, a couple of those, especially there at the end, if you just want to look at those basic definitions, it kind of sounds like jealousy is maybe not such a bad thing. But let's talk about it. Let's look at the parameters of jealousy. So Acts chapter 7, verse 9. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen is giving his defense before the council, before he is stoned at the end of Acts chapter 7. And in the midst of that, he references back to Joseph and his brothers. And you know that Joseph was the one that was beloved of his father. His father gave him the coat of many colors. Joseph had the dreams where he dreamed that his brother and father and brothers were bowing down before him and all those things. So you know the story about Joseph, but just that simple verse, Acts chapter 7, verse 9, the patriarchs, that is his 11 brothers, or really his 10 older brothers, the 10 older brothers became jealous of Joseph and sold him into slavery. And so they looked at the relationship that he had with his father. They looked at that coat of many colors, that prestigious gift that his father had given him. They looked at the dreams that he was having that indicated that he was going to be over them in some way, and they became jealous. And that jealousy then led them to do something really unthinkable, which was to sell him into slavery. not knowing if he was going to be murdered, not knowing if his life was going to be forfeit or not. They sold him into slavery into Egypt based on jealousy. That was not a loving thing to do. They did not demonstrate love to their brother when they sold him into slavery. Acts chapter 17, and I noticed also in our Bible study this morning in our class, we were finishing up Acts chapter 13, a similar statement made in Acts chapter 13 as well, but in Acts chapter 17, Paul, as he goes into the city of Thessalonica and he begins teaching the gospel, and people begin responding to the gospel. In verse 5 it says, "But the Jews, becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace, formed a mob and set the city in an uproar, and attacking the house of Jason, they were seeking to bring them out to the people." And so something similar happened in Acts chapter 13 as well, that when Paul would go into a city and begin teaching in the synagogue and having responses to his preaching, that the Jews who wanted to maintain control over their people would become jealous of the things that Paul was achieving and accomplishing. And so they would try to thwart his efforts. They would try to respond in a way. They were led to do things that were not proper based on their emotional response to the things that Paul was doing. They were jealous. And so jealousy then can lead people to do something that is completely wrong. They led to riots and to stonings and all of those things in the book of Acts. But then let's take a step back from that. Let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 12. We looked at this verse last week. It was actually the kind of the theme verse for the lesson last week. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 31, it says, "But earnestly desire the greater gifts, and I show you still a more excellent way." And that's when Paul begins talking about love. But Paul, that word there, "but earnestly desire the greater gifts," it's the same word. It's the same word as jealous that he uses just a few verses later when he says love is not jealous. But just a few verses earlier he had said, be jealous. And so that leads to some questions, right? I mean, how can we, on the one hand, be commanded to do it, on the other hand, be told that if we want to be loving people, we don't do it? Well, I think it's got to do with this. It's not the intensity of the desire that makes jealousy counterproductive to love. We can desire something earnestly with all of our hearts. We can be very zealous for something. And that's a proper emotion in its context, but then what makes it improper is, first of all, it needs to be a good object, right? It needs to be an object that we should desire. If it's an object that is not my right to have, or it's not something that is holy or blameless or righteous, then I have no right to desire that thing in that way. And so what we desire matters, but also what are we willing to do to achieve it? What are we willing to do to gain that thing? And if I'm willing to go out and sacrifice relationships, or I'm willing to go out and harm other people or steal or take something that's not mine, even though I might say, well, it was a good thing. That thing that I wanted was a good thing, but I went about achieving it in the wrong way. That makes it fall into this category of jealousy that Paul condemns. Love is not jealous. Love does not lead us to desire something that we shouldn't have, and love does not lead us to claim something that we should have in a way that we shouldn't claim it, if that makes sense. And so love doesn't lead us down the wrong path. Love leads us only to those things that are proper. Love also is not arrogant. Love is not arrogant. And this one simply means to inflate or to puff up. If you have the King James or maybe the New King James, it won't use the word arrogant. It'll actually say puffed up. Love is not puffed up. And it's kind of a word that they use for the bellows of a forge. If you think about an iron worker or a blacksmith having his forge and he needed to get those coals hot, and he would pump up the bellows to blow air across the coals. But if you overinflate those bellows, what happens? They burst and they end up becoming useless. And so it's good to have it inflated to a certain level, but to overinflate it is a bad thing. And that's arrogance when applied to people. And so turn back a few pages in 1 Corinthians to 1 Corinthians chapter 8. verses 1 through 3. We looked at this one last week as well, I believe. 1 Corinthians 8, 1 through 3 says, "Now concerning things sacrificed to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge makes arrogant, but love edifies. If anyone supposes that he knows anything, he has not yet known as he ought to know, but if anyone loves God, he is known by him." And so here Paul draws that contrast between what arrogance does versus what love does. Love does not build up oneself. Love does not make oneself bigger than they should be. And Jesus talked about this in relation to taking a seat at a table at a banquet, right? If you walk into the banquet and you see the head of the table is open, don't assume it's for you, because if you go sit down at the head of the table, that's arrogant. And what happens when the real person that they're honoring at the banquet steps in? Well, then you get asked to move to the foot of the table, and it's an embarrassment and a shame for you in that moment. Better rather to sit at the foot of the table, and then if they want you at the head of the table, they'll move you there, and they'll be the ones that build you up. Don't build yourselves up. Don't be arrogant. And love is not arrogant. Love does not seek its own. Love doesn't promote itself, is what Paul is saying here. And if you look at Romans chapter 12, verse 3 and then verse 9, we see another good contrast here, I think, that gives us something to think about. So Romans chapter 12, this idea of arrogance in Romans chapter 12, verse 3, "For through the grace given to me, I say to every man among you, not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think so as to have sound judgment, as God has allotted to each a measure of faith." Don't puff yourself up. Don't blow yourself up. Don't inflate yourself over what you're supposed to be. Remain humble. What did Jesus do on the night that he was betrayed? He took a towel and he got down on his knees and he washed the feet of his disciples. He could have demanded that they wash his feet, because he is the Son of God, because he was the rabbi, he was the teacher, and they were all his disciples. It would have been appropriate for him to demand that of them. But he didn't puff himself up. He didn't make himself to be arrogant. He humbled himself. And Paul here says that we need to do that same thing, have that same attitude, and not puff ourselves up. But then he says in verse 9, that first phrase there in verse 9, "Let love be without hypocrisy." Okay, when we think about all the things that we've studied about love and loving one another and loving our neighbor and sacrificing for other people and doing things for other people, that is not, it's not something that we can do in relationship with building ourselves up. I can't stand before you all the time and build myself up and build myself up and build myself up and then go out and claim, well, now I'm going to serve. Because those two don't go together. We need to be people who are servants and be people who build others up and are not constantly inflating our own egos. And then finally this morning, love is not provoked. Love is not provoked. And this one probably is something that you're familiar with, the idea to arouse anger, to incite anger in someone else, to jab someone or stimulate their feelings. Listen, I'm the youngest of 6 kids. I know how to push the buttons of every one of my older siblings, right? I knew how to get a response out of every one of them, because that's the job of a little brother. And so I could poke and poke and poke, and then when it was time for them to blow up, then I'd run to mom, right? And that I was just good at that. That wasn't very loving. It wasn't very loving, some of the things they did to me either, but we won't talk about those. But we don't want to be people who are constantly going around and poking other people, jabbing at them, trying to get an emotional response out of them, provoking them to then do something that is not a response in love, right? Isn't it irritating when somebody pokes and pokes and pokes, and then you've had enough and you blow up at them and you have an angry response, and then they look back and say, well, that wasn't very loving. Well, what have you been doing to me for the last half hour? And so that's the attitude there, not provoking a non-loving response in somebody else. And this is another one of those kind of unique words. The only other time it's used is in Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17, verse 16, kind of an opposite way of using it, but in Acts 17, Paul is in Athens, and he's kind of waiting for some of his companions to join him there. And as he is touring around and looking at the city, presumably for the first time, it seems like it's the first time he's ever been there, the way the story is written, and he's seeing some of the sights. It says in verse 16, "Now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing the city full of idols." He was having a visceral response to seeing all of these idols dedicated to false gods. And in that case, that's probably a good response, and it led him to preach a sermon that attracted people to the gospel. And so, we can be, but sometimes, as we mentioned earlier, anger can be an appropriate response to certain things. But Paul channeled that anger into preaching a sermon about the God of the universe. Well, that's probably appropriate. But we don't want to be people who go around provoking inappropriate responses out of other people. And so think about it. Have you ever lost your temper? If you say no, you're lying, and that's a whole nother sin. So have you ever lost your temper? Have you ever responded in anger to something that somebody else did and then tried to use as a justification for that? Well, they made me mad. They did that, and my response is justified. My response is their fault because they did that to me first. That's what we're talking about. And it was wrong for them to do that. I'm not justifying what they did to bring about that response in you, but have you ever been the one that was doing the poking? Have you ever been the one that was provoking someone else to anger? That's what Paul says. Love is not provoked. Love does not allow other people to poke us to the point that we have that anger response, and we certainly don't go around provoking other people to have that response. We sometimes do that. They made me so mad. They did that knowing it was going to set me off. They knew they were pushing my buttons. They knew they were just trying to get a rise out of me. All of those things, and we say that, we do that to justify our anger response when what we need to be doing is looking for a loving response in those situations. They did this to Jesus constantly, if you think about it. All the time they were trying to entrap him. They were asking him questions, hoping to trip him up according to the law. They were putting him in scenarios where they said, here's a scenario, what would you do? Hoping that they had it worded correctly so that there was no correct response, or that however he responded, they would have a way to accuse him. How did Jesus respond when he was being nailed to a cross? Unjustly. I mean, if there was ever a time when it would have been okay to be provoked to anger, it's when you're being nailed to a cross for sins that were not your own. And as he was being nailed to that cross, what did he say? Forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's the loving response. And he did not allow himself to be provoked to anger in that situation. And so love is not provoked. Love does not allow others to drive us into anger. And love, certainly from our perspective, does not allow us to drive other people into anger as well. So our call to action today, our wrap up to this lesson, is this question: how are you working to improve the quality of your love? And so, again, stepping back from that big overarching topic of love, and I want to be more loving, and I want to love my neighbor more appropriately, and I want to love God ever deeper and ever more appropriately in that relationship as well. But sometimes we think about, that's a really big topic. And so we look at, maybe one or two things that we did, and well, those were loving things, but is my love overall growing? Well, let's take a step back from love itself and let's begin looking at its component parts. Have I been kind this week? Have I been patient? Were there times when people provoked me to anger? Or were there times when I said something provocatively knowing that it would get a rise out of somebody? Or have I demonstrated jealousy towards wanting something that I don't have a right to? All of those things are the component parts of love, and we need to be looking at each of those things individually, because all of those things relate to this overall category of love that we're talking about. And as I want to be somebody who loves, then I need to be patient and I need to be kind. I shouldn't be jealous. I shouldn't be provoking others, and I shouldn't be arrogant. Those are things that I can look at more specifically to gauge my growth in love. And that's what I want to challenge you to do this week, is to look at those component parts, those qualities of love, and see if you're growing in those things. If you have any need this morning that we can help you with, whether it be for prayers or for Bible study or for whatever we can help you with, would you please come while we stand and sing?